I'm Chris Woodruff, professor of development economics at the University of Oxford, and I'll be moderating the panel today, which is the policy panel from the conference on fostering growth in developing countries. Just a bit of housekeeping that the session's being recorded and live streamed, and in addition to the audiences that we have on either end, we're going to have some discussion with the panel. Hopefully, it will be in a sort of a interactive discussion kind of format, and then we'll save 20 minutes or so at the end for questions from the audience. So we'll have time for you to intervene. So we're delighted today to be joined by three people who have long been involved in thinking about development and working on development themselves in various ways, but now also hold policy positions at important funders and important investors in the development space. So I'll introduce Dean Karlan, who's a professor of economics and finance at Northwestern University and is currently also chief economist at USAID, co-director of the Global Poverty Research Lab, and as most of us probably know and appreciate, founder of Innovations for Poverty Action as well. Liz Lloyd is Chief Impact Officer at British International Investment. She was previously at Standard Chartered and was a Deputy Chief of Staff for Prime Minister Tony Blair and Senior Advisor on Africa. So again, a long history in the development space and in the investment space in particular in development. And finally, Adnan Khan, who's a professor of public policy at LSE and is currently seconded as chief economist at FCDO here in the UK. So I'm gonna start by asking a few questions, and again, I hope we can make this you can respond to each other, and we can make this a bit interactive. Let me start with a very general question, and I'll start with you, Adnan. How can donors and investors effectively further private sector investment? What is it from a donor perspective that you feel like people can that FCDO, for example, should be doing, or that other donors should be doing to further private sector investment in developing countries?
Yeah. So thank you, Chris. Donors can do quite a lot. Don't always do, but can do. Three things. Their direct role is in making investments, interventions, programs, and policies. Their role is also in terms of promoting innovations. But ultimately, it's also boils down to promoting economic growth. And let me start with that one and then come to others. I think we have come to a point where while we realize the value of economic growth, unfortunately, there's far less discussion of economic growth in many fora than it should be. We almost seem to be embarrassed by economic growth, especially in developed countries. But when it comes to poor, low-income countries, there's no other pathway to lifting people out of extreme poverty than economic growth. Yes, it has to be of the right type. But we often write whole paragraphs with all the qualifiers. And the point about growth, it has to be growth to be able to be inclusive, sustainable, and all the other qualifiers often gets lost. I think that point needs to be highlighted by researchers, but also needs, I think that we still need to make a point, make a case for growth in, and that's where donors can come in and can have an impact. Related to the question is, yes, climate change is important. I think the question for donors and where researchers can also come in is the question of context specificity in terms of carbon decarbonization strategies in different countries. Those pathways will look very different in low-income countries than in middle-income countries like India or others, or in high-income countries. And again, something that I think donors have a big role in terms of shaping. but also not just in terms of like conditionalities and others, but also in terms of like influencing, having a frank conversation, also candid conversation with policymakers in developing countries. Investments, again, that's big thing that I don't want to steal the thunder of my Liz, but that's what like donors do quite a lot. And there are lots of claims about catalytic and transformational investments. The key question is, are these really catalytic and transformational? That's an open question. So donors can have a big impact in transformational and catalytic investment, whether they actually do have. And that's a question, again, like I think for researchers also in terms of both measuring what is catalytic transformative, but also in terms of helping donors in terms of the decision framework for picking up the right. And lastly, innovation. So innovations are not just like responding to innovations, but also thinking of the appropriateness of innovations. Jacob Moscana's type of like what type of innovations are important. Policies that shape innovations, again, donors have a big role to think of like not just their own, but also like a future of work and technology and how that affect the development agenda. Stephanie, Danny and others. But also like innovation that can help the climate compatible growth agenda, again, donors have. I think the key question is what kind of policy levers should the donors be using in terms of like, seeding, furthering, and those innovations. And that's a question not just for donors, also for researchers. Let me stop.
But Liz, let me come to you with that. So Adnan says we need to focus on growth. How does BI, and I should have probably said in the introduction, in addition to being at Oxford, I'm now a non-executive director at BII. So Liz and I work together quite a lot at BII on these issues. But how do you think about it at BII in terms of growth versus poverty alleviation of making investments and thinking about how you sort of go across those two areas?
I mean, I guess we do think that growth is important. And so, I mean, essentially we have sort of three sectors that we invest in: infrastructure, financial services, and basically, I guess, everything else, the real economy. And there are some types of investments which are indirect. And these are some of the ones that are hardest to explain to stakeholders in the public because, you know, power or financial services, building capital markets, certainly anything that is about building sort of more kind of, for example, if you wanted to build secondary capital markets, I mean, that is so kind of invisible that sometimes external scrutiny and external stakeholders find this and the impact chain is quite hard to follow. But we are, I mean, what we try and do is invest in sort of low-income countries, obviously, and think very carefully about the beneficiaries, the stakeholders. So where we can measure that, we measure that. Where we can have proxies, we have proxies. And we obviously make an assessment before we make any investment of what we think it'll do, and then we monitor it very carefully through that. I think the other thing that we think of this question of sort of donors, investors, is the role of a development finance institution. And that's quite interesting because it is on the cusp of a donor and an investor. So the thing that we think very carefully about is our additionality or our contribution, which is where are we doing something that someone else isn't for productive economic growth. And that is what we probably spend the most time thinking about, which is not distorting the market, but ideally crowding in other people. I mean, this is one of the hardest things, I think, for DFOs to get right. But that is sort of the point of us, to try and get that question right.
Right. So I mean, let me pick up on one thing you said and just sort of flag as we kind of begin to think in this conversation about research topics and ways researchers can engage on some of these topics. This idea of kind of thinking about not whether the direct effects of an investment, but the indirect effects of that investment, either upstream or downstream, seems to me
yes.
something that maybe none of us do as well as we could in terms of these sorts of organizations, in a place where I think that maybe some academic research might be quite useful. Dean, let me turn to you. So Adnan said, let me put you on the spot a bit. Adnan said that sort of intimated that that donors and funders need to use leverage in some senses and get governments and to do things that are that we might think are ultimately in their benefits, but to their benefit, but they may not initially see it that way. What do you think is in general, not necessarily with any specific donor in mind, but just in general, what do we think is the role of kind of this advice bundled with investment and donation?
So first of all, I think it's a very different conversation in the investment versus the donor space. Although, you could argue that's, I'm sure there's things that cross over, but I have an overall sentiment that starting with philanthropists who are wealthy but still small, that there's only so much money that they have, and so they can think on the margin about what they can do with it, or they can try to think about whether what they're doing can help leverage other people's money and shift a larger organization in the way they're behaving. And it just goes up from there, right? So, now take a bilateral, take, FCDO, take USAID, two of the largest, probably the two largest, I'm thinking, not sure the rank order, but two of the largest bilateral agencies. At the end of the day, the amount of money spent in a country, there's tons of documents, I'm sure, in both that say the goal is growth. And then you think about what a very simple back of the envelope calculation could possibly generate out of the amount of money being given. And yet you're putting growth as the goal for you plan to do with that money. It defies logic, like something's missing. And so the way to, if you can, the way to think about it would be that if that money is, where's the big money coming from? It's the local government. So if there is a way to segue, then that's the sweet spot. And we do see some examples of this happening, but I think you got to start slightly less ambitiously. Don't start with a growth as the target. Examples where we have seen that kind of mindset work are, education. You want to move the needle in the way education works at the ministry level, and the way they're working with teachers and training teachers and designing curriculum and things like this. You can take small donor money, and by small I mean literally USAID counts as small now when you compare it to the Ministry of Education's budget. You can set up an innovative lab if they want to know, okay, here's things that have worked elsewhere, but will it work for us? Great. Set up some tests, but then you're on ramp to knowing, if this works, we then immediately scale it within policy. So when that's possible, that is wonderful. We don't see enough of that. We want to see more. It's not always possible. Go to Somalia. We were talking about Somalia earlier, right? If you don't have a local government that has the kind of the ability to innovate in that way and test and be a party to that, and has that you're going to be working with a ministry that's going to be there in 5 years, you need that kind of thing. So it's not always, in not all countries is that kind of mindset possible, but when possible, that is a great way to think about the role we can play.
Great. Liz, let me come back to you. Adnan mentioned climate, and climate is obviously it's a global concern. It's a global issue. How do you think about it? How does BII think about investment in sort of what we might think of as a new era in which we have to be climate concerned, and yet in most of the places we're investing, these are not at this. Most of the places are not big contributors at this point to the climate crisis. They're feeling the impacts more than they're contributing. How do you think about kind of?
Well, there are sort of three planks of our approach. One is supporting or investing behind a net zero transition. So in some areas, that is, as it were, very straightforward, more renewable power, electric vehicles rather than ICE vehicles. It's extremely consistent with other areas of sort of productive economic growth, innovation, resource efficiency, and so on. Then the second is around adaptation and resilience. And I think for the private sector, there are some areas which, for example, equipping workers with places to go which are cooler or water, sort of really good job quality, or kind of stress testing investments for rising sea levels. So that is something that we also think about. I think for all private investors, the sort of percentage amount going into what is tagged adaptation and resilience is relatively lower. I think some of that's methodological, but also some of that is that it's not necessarily private sector. And some of it is that we need to do more. And then the third area is what we call, or rather, think of as just transition, which is this sort of skilling or reskilling, or thinking about areas of countries which maybe once sort of decarbonized won't have the industries that they have today. So you'll be looking in South Africa and India, where you have very kind of carbon heavy industries. So I think there's an awful lot which is extremely consistent with aims of productive and inclusive economic growth. I think the areas which are being debated sort of very widely, and I think in anywhere, is where there is limited amounts of grant money, of concessional capital. It is, how do you allocate that? And, if you're to solve sort of purely for carbon, as it were, then that would probably be going to more middle income countries. If you're sort of solving purely for maybe poverty reduction, it probably isn't. I mean, one of the great things about my job is that every day we are addressing any one of these numerous problems which has no perfect answer. So it doesn't have a perfect answer, and we will do a bit of both, and we will try in as far as we invest in, for example, India and South Africa, to really focus on the most inclusive end of those types of investments that we can.
Dean, let me ask you this sort of similar question. How do you see? I mean, you've done work in huge numbers of areas, but you've done a lot of work in agriculture and the agricultural space, which is one of the places where the effects of climate change are going to be felt the most ferociously. How do you see the let me say trade-off, but maybe you don't think of it as a trade-off. You feel free to change that word, between sort of climate investing and development investing.
So I don't have one simple answer, but I have a few related thoughts. One is that I think we're overthinking a lot of times adaptation, an ability to absorb shocks, and forgetting that the single best way to have someone who is really, really poor be able to weather the storm, no pun intended, is to make them richer. And it's not to say there isn't something to be said if there's some crop that is less weather resistant and from variation and things like this, that's not good. But like, it seems when I see that, like, so much of the money and attention on adaptation goes into like the new technology, the new this, the new that, it's never really clear. You have all these problems of technology adoption, when the fact is, the reason why everybody sitting in this room is worried about climate change on a philosophical level, but nobody in this room is sitting around wondering how we're going to eat in 5 or 10 years, right? Why? It's because we're all rich, right? And now we're not going to be able to like exceed that kind of grand level, but reality is that's the best way to help someone who's really, really poor and vulnerable to become more resilient, is just diversified sources of income and more wealth.
Can you do that? So
and the climate, the adaptation is fine. You can add it in, but focusing on that is I think critical.
But so does that happen fast enough? Is that going to happen fast enough? Suppose it's sort of making people richer. Suppose you say,
but like, if you show me a faster way, then let's do that. Let's not this. I'm all for speed, right? Whatever the fastest way possible, but I'm not sure what the alternative is. Sorry, I feel like I cut you off.
No. I cut you off. But I guess I wonder if anyway, so let me ask Adnan for a view on that. So
Let me just add one
yeah,
other
okay.
thing to it. That was
Yeah.
it said I had, I think,
Yeah.
2 things I wanted to say on climate. The second is, we have a real problem on the voluntary carbon markets that I think everybody's well aware of, and yet we still see people playing in them. Don't understand how everybody can sit around going, yeah, they're messed up, and then still play in them. Like, go fix them. And there's just a basic accounting issue. There's and there's some, so there's property rights issues. And if that's something that infrastructure money could go to spend, that's, one of those systems changes where I actually like the use of that term. But, until then, it seems like we're doing a lot of false advertising on what we're doing, and we ought to really, shut that down. But and that with that, the flip side of that is, I understand it. And again, I'm not a tech guru on the climate issue, so I'm like, this is what I understand to be, is that we do need more money spent on innovation. Like, things like improving land use actually is like a wonderful twofer. Right? If you can take a poor farmer and help improve the quantity of food that is produced out of their farm, that helps make them richer, goes back to the first point. But when it comes down to the problem with all of the efforts at like stopping deforestation, there's just some really obvious general equilibrium issues that if you're not doing something about the quantity of food that is produced out of the land that is arable, then you have a problem. And so that's just a much more direct way of trying to deal with climate change, is more innovation on the farming side. That doesn't need to be focused on climate per se. It just needs to be focused on getting higher output per acre.
Adnan, I'm going to turn to you. What do you think? What do you think? Should we focus? You started with growth, but do we focus entirely on growth, or is how much do the agencies and aid agencies need to think about directly kind of trying to attack adaptation and resilience?
Both. So first, yeah, growth is needed, and I think Dean also said that. Dean disagreed about like our role or our agency or like our efficacy in promoting growth. I do think we have quite a lot, both in terms of ideas, think gains, ideas or dead economies, whatever that. But also in terms of like discussions and more collaborations with countries in growth in low-income countries. But we also have a role in terms of the agenda on adaptation and resilience. Not a commercial break, but UK is also like already playing a big role in terms of the international climate finance, in terms of the agenda, but mostly on the mitigation agenda, where there's far less is the adaptation and resilience agenda also. I think we also have a role. And I completely agree that we need to both spend more, but also like promote more innovations. Innovations, all kinds of innovations, not just technological, but also other innovations that both help us to resolve this dilemma, but also flatten the curve, like if to the extent that there is a trade-off, at least in some countries.
Great. Let me shift the topic a bit, and let's talk a bit about how academic researchers can engage with various kinds of aid organizations and so forth. And Liz, let me start with you by asking how, and BII very pragmatic kind of day-to-day, I'm trying to find investments on the ground. I'm trying to make investments that do good without losing money, as the motto goes. What's the role for research, either on the consumption or production side, that is either using research or producing research for DFI like BII?
I mean, I think, well, we are kind of consumers of research, very much so, for all of our kind of impact pathways and guidance on, I think I caught the end of the last session talking about planning. It's not quite planning because the market is a little bit more lively than that. But in terms of sort of allocation between sectors, allocation between products, equity, debt, short-term, long-term, allocation between countries. So any of the basics, as in, I think on the public sector side, Adnan's predecessor, Rachel Glenister, did sort of best bets. really kind of simple.
Mhm.
This is good. This is better. This is really good. That is really helpful, I think, for all impact investors and DFIs. And then I think, there are some other topics that I have particular I think that there's a bit of a dearth of some which have been around the houses forever, like SME, and IGC has done lots of work with sort of like SMEs or big firms. Which one we just mean? So I think the answer is, I don't really know what the answer is. As far as I can tell, the answer is both are good, but one is not necessarily better. They're maybe slightly better for different things, but that one keeps coming round and round.
Sorry, just to clarify, that is whether you should be investing in SMEs,
specifically focused
investing
on
in big firms.
whether in any given potential investment is a SME sort of better for
Right.
job creation, quality job creation, sustainable job creation, economic growth, or anything, competition, innovation, any of these things, employment of women, all of these things. Talking about women, we want more economic opportunities for women, and I think we're actually trying to do some research right now about understanding the relative relationship between senior leadership and firm behavior. And I think probably there hasn't been that long a run of having enough senior leaders in our markets to have that, and the data quality is not great to look at this. But this is obviously really important to understand all of these relationships. And then I guess the last one that is on my mind again, which is a bit of a sort of comes around, is sort of local currency, local capital markets, like versus foreign direct investment and foreign and international trade and kind of globalized. And this is a very interesting topic. And again, over years comes and goes somewhat. It seems again a little bit lively. So these are some sort of big questions, and then there's lots of little
Right.
ones. And as being useful, I'm not quite sure how useful we can be. We have the FCDO does some very good long run evaluations of our portfolio where they get very good access to our information, but a lot of it is not sort of terribly sort of available. So I know that's a bit of a headache for researchers, particularly.
Let me turn this to you, Adnan, and ask it in a slightly more provocative way, which is a lot of organizations I've worked with who, as a researcher, who are doing the kinds of things that any of the organizations we're talking about are doing, where they've got programs on the ground. So it may be investment programs, it may be aid programs on the ground. There's always been resistance from the teams that are on the ground to having anybody engaged with them doing, any outsider engaged with them doing research. So both FCDO and USAID, for example, support massive amounts of research, but how much do they do on their own programs and their own, using the scale of the interventions that FCDO does? How do we think about the role of researchers more directly in the programs? In addition to, I don't want to say anything negative about the support you give to researchers through things like IGC and PEDAL and so forth, but there seems an opportunity here that we don't always capture. And how do we think about that?
I agree. I also love the way you censored yourself. So, first, from my own experience of having worked in different policy organizations in a developing country, also developed country context, I do see FCDO as one of the far better ones where it does engage with evidence in multiple ways, both as consumers, but also as commissioners of evidence and learning, funding a lot of programs, like a lot of programs in this room also, like IGC, PEDAL, STAG also. And you'll be surprised, maybe not surprised, I'm happy to know that when I look at the programs that we fund, like completely different, not research side. So research side does care hugely about it. both in terms of extending frontiers of knowledge on important policy questions, but also shaping the policy agenda, both ours, but also developing countries. I'm also like positively surprised that when I see business cases at FCDO, they all mention like research, and not just our funded research, but any research. Is that sufficient? Is that enough? Perhaps not. Where I think we need to do a better job is to embed research within our programs and intervention from the very beginning. So throughout my life, like I've gone through a transition. My first job was as a policy actor, and my boss told me, "Don't think, act." So throughout my life, like I've been trying to move away from that model. You can imagine, like the type of life.
Yeah, you really
Why
want to
one or the other?
I can come to the research side also. So if we do research, they will come and notice and they will act. Is the other like a caricature of the research. If we build, they will come. And throughout, like the idea is to move beyond those worlds and to some of the best that I've seen are like where we act now and learn later. I think the goal, the ultimate holy grail, is to act and think at the same time, to embed research from the very beginning into the design of the program, so that in some sense, like research, evidence, learning becomes endogenous to the design and implementation of the program, and that also makes influence endogenous. I think, if I'm very honest, like we also have some way to go in making that. Again, for all the reasons that you're mentioning, like individual, how people individually respond to evidence and incentives, their incentive profile, risk aversion, all of those reasons. We're doing far better, but like I think there's far more to go, if I'm honest.
Dean, you've been on both sides of this as
Yeah.
a researcher, and now more as and now kind of looking at it. At least I'm beginning to think about this from the policy side. How do you think about that engagement? How do we do better at getting the conversation between policymakers at this level and researchers?
So, a couple thoughts, and this actually is one of the reasons why I did join USAID, is to try to help create more of a bridge. And that bridge is, there's problems on both sides of that bridge that make it disconnected. There's a couple things that are important kind of principles to remember. One is that a lot of times at the donor, when you're thinking about funding programs and then attaching kind of research or evaluations to it, there's an over-reliance on your own evidence and your own data, and guiding that. And there's a mindset of like, what proportion of our awards have an impact evaluation? And I just don't like that question at all. I think the question should be, what proportion of our awards for which are running programs that do not have a strong evidentiary base as being an effective intervention? What proportion of those are we doing evaluations so that we can contribute to the global public good of learning what's working, right? And so two different things have to change there. You have to really think hard about when you're going to attach impact evaluations, when you're not, but you also then, that forces you to think hard about how do you attach the impact evaluation in a way that actually is going to speak to the global community. It's not going to just be some inward-looking document to satisfy your internal bureaucratic needs. So that's shifting a little bit of the mindset and the thinking about when is it appropriate to attach research. Internally, I can tell you that, like, FCDO, for instance, I think I'm pretty sure if we added up the funding that FCDO is funded towards the, certainly to the randomized controlled trial space of research compared to USAID, it's like night and day. But that's partly because FCDO has been funding things that are actually like research pots of money for that, as compared to just like attaching things to awards that are evaluating very specific things. One of our goals is very much to address the internal issue at USAID of sentiment that it's too complicated or it costs too much money. And I think so far from what we've seen, a lot of that is a matter of not having the right networks and not having the right technical know-how on how to do that.
So sorry, the right networks. Who doesn't have the right networks? The
USAID.
The
If
US.
you're in a mission,
The
if you're
people
in a
USAID.
country at USAID and you want to set up a randomized trial,
I see.
you're not connected to the, you don't, the networks aren't there, right? The typical, USAID contractors.
Yeah.
There's a few that do randomized trials, but they do what they're hired to do. They don't typically weigh in and say, here's a better way. They just take the bids as is. So, they're not connected to people who are thinking about the knowledge generation. They're connected to people who are thinking, how do I comply with the requests in this RFP? And that's a very different mindset of filling in a knowledge gap versus like checking a box of, what's asked for in an evaluation. But then there's also just technical things where we can help. And so look, our office was modeled off of Adnan's office. So thank you for going first and setting some good paths for us. And the office of the chief economist is new at USAID. There has never been one before. There's been chief economists, but not an office.
I see.
That's a boring list of distinctions. I won't bore you with, but I'm told by the powers that be that that's a key distinction that is enabling us to set some more ambitious goals institutionally.
Interesting.
But we also, now I just want to be clear on the academic side, there's a lot that we don't do academically. So two things in particular that we don't do academically, where a lot of our some of it is really like detailed and obvious, like putting cost data into our papers when you're running an evaluation. It's kind of depressing, and I actually will fully admit that you can look at my papers and you can say, how can you that I'm at fault for someone to do. Like, I've gotten better, I've learned. Now I don't do it, but you look at some of my old papers and I'm embarrassed. We don't do enough thinking on measurement. We don't do enough meta-analysis. It's not rewarded as much historically, and it should be. And so as a byproduct of that, if you're wanting a donor to move policy, and the best you can do is say, here's a paper from halfway around the world that speaks to this. Like, as a right-minded person says, okay, that's a really nice one data point. Show me more. And so, and now for some things that's easier. We want to do cash transfers. That's easier. In fact, we're about to release like that 58 meta-analysis of 58 randomized trials of unconditional cash transfers. You want to do the things we're talking about here earlier that you're facing, for instance, on investment. That's much harder to do. If you're dealing with larger industry, you don't have 17 interventions across the world doing the same kind of thing to be able to do that kind of meta-analysis. But that just puts a little bit more of the onus on the academic too, to try to think through, like, well, what is the unifying theory that we're learning here that actually can help guide investors.
Good. I want to open up for questions, but I'm going to put Liz on the spot one more time at the end here and just say, can you think of sort of modalities, ways that we should be engaging that we're not engaging, that we as researchers with organizations like BII that we're not engaging? Are there sort of ways we should be trying to come together to exchange ideas on both sides, we need better evidence on this, or we could help generate evidence on that?
I mean, I'm sure there are. I mean, a lot of it is around sort of understanding where the other person's coming from. I mean, I think probably even in the academic, most of the academic sort of, well, actually not most, there's a bunch of sort of research that is around donor funded programs, and some specialists and some experts, and from evaluators to researchers, that is so different from an investor. And just, so the overlap of people who understand development policy and who understand investment, I have found it seems to be quite small. So which is why you end up with just that one sort of, evaluation from Chile, which is not even in our geography. So I don't quite know how you fix that aside from growing the pot even bigger.
Great. Let me open it up to questions, both here in London and in New Haven as well. So I'll start here with a couple, and I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions together, and then we'll have an answer, and then do the same. So you need to use the mic, and you need to hold the button down while you're talking, so that people in New Haven can hear as well. If you could just give your name and
Model. Okay, thank you so much. Hi, thank you so much for the session. My name is Shreyansh Singh. I'm from India and I'm doing a master's here at LSE in economic policy in international development. And I really loved all the point of views and perspectives. So I had like two questions, short ones. Like one is a more broader one and second is more specific. So when we talk, the broader one is more of when you talk about investments, there's a lot of involvement of foreign actors with local governments. And I just wanted to ask, what sort of political challenges do we have to navigate through? Because there's certain sense of autonomy that let's say the local governments have, and when foreign actors come in and try to guide with some policies and pointers and some key points. So how do we actually navigate through the political challenges when something like this happens? And my second question is a little specific to what Professor Khan was saying, that I wanted to ask, like, is the space of policymaking sort of has an entrepreneurial nature to it? For example, the book that comes to mind is from Lean Startup by Eric Ries, that how in businesses and in startup, you just enter the space and you sort of make decisions and you sort of see whether to sustain in that effort or to pivot. So I just wanted to ask, when it comes to developmental policy, I'll be very cautious to use this analogy of a startup and planning a development policy for a country, because does the policy space provide you that freedom to kind of pivot while you're in the process of deciding and thinking and at the same time applying? Because that I really like the mixture of applying and thinking at the same time, because in a startup you have more freedom to do that. Yeah.
Finish up. Okay, great. Take another here.
Hi. So my question, Rania from the International Growth Center, my question is that you started off with the discussion on how it's important to focus on economic growth, Adnan, about how the other qualifiers are secondary qualifiers, essentially. Dean, you brought a similar point that we should make people richer. I'm curious to, yes, I agree, but I have a limited time. Okay, so my question is more about, why are a lot of the donors in philanthropic and government shifting focus more towards sustainability and climate change and putting pressure on the developing countries, which aren't necessarily the producers of the climate issues, to be the ones to deal with it? And how tangible is that trade-off?
Any questions from Yale?
Do I? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we have one with
Two. Maybe come up here so they can hear you. Yeah. Okay.
just shout to the ceiling.
Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. My question is just regarding donors, that when they offer funding to government, they tend to influence, string attached. And whether in most cases, I feel as if it doesn't really benefit the masses and those who really need that policy change. So what do you have to say about that? String attached when donors offer money to government or to certain institutions with string attached.
We've got one more. If you can take one more, Chris.
Let's take one more.
Okay, Morgan, yeah, come.
Hi, this is super interesting. I guess with the discussion of climate change and growth, I feel like there's this implicit assumption almost that there's like a fixed geographic space that you would be investing in or trying to kind of facilitate growth. And something I've been thinking about a lot recently is kind of increased inevitability of the need for moving people, from places that are becoming increasingly difficult to inhabit. And so how are you thinking about each of your roles and kind of that, the issues that are faced with forced migration? Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's let the panel give answers. Let me start on this end with you, Dean. Take whichever ones you want,
Sure.
and then we'll make sure at the end that we've given some answer to all four.
So I think I can combine a couple.
Okay,
Actually, for what it's
excellent.
worth. I think this is a partial answer to your question. I think there's a fundamental difference between, kind of thinking about a specific investment, BII in the way you describe kind of a process. So, and I'll say something about that in just 1 second, versus, going after kind of broad policy. What I can tell you, I don't think we need more of is spending tons of money on rich people to go and do systems, catalytic, empowerment. There's a few other words we can add in here. Enabling systems. Did I say systems yet? I'd love that word. Systems. Let's build systems. And it's a double-edged sword. Not only am I making fun of like this kind of ambiguous, amorphous, what are you actually doing? But think about where the money's actually going. You're paying a bunch of rich people. You're going to spend the money back in rich countries. Okay, so it's just not saying it can never work, but there aren't some things that are at that kind of systems level that need to be dealt with. But I would think about it much more at the micro level. By micro, I don't mean tiny, I mean at the investment level. And if there's specific bottlenecks for making a type of investment or seeing a specific type of firm or industry grow, then you can work upwards and think, okay, here's the legislative regulatory changes that need to happen that is holding back this industry. But that's not the way we tend to see these things happen. You just go to a bunch of rich people who go around and then think top down. And so then when I would think about it at the investment level, and this goes a little bit to why I reacted when you said that flip. It was like, because my point was actually no, like look, growth is great, don't get me wrong, but like think about the type of growth that we're going to be experiencing. Right? We are growing as a world, and our efficiency, our productivity per labor is going way up with technology. So this is scary, right? So I'm not personally, I don't lay up at night worrying about what the global GDP is going to be. I worry about the inclusivity of that. And I don't think there's much that anybody in this room is doing or could do to move global GDP or country level GDP. But we can do something about inclusivity, and that's where my passion is and intention is, and I think that's demand. So that's why I was. But when we think about the investment level, then this is where there's, I think, a lot of self-serving. I'm not saying you're doing this, trust me, the way you described it sounded good. I'm going to talk through specifics of an investment, but like you said, nice buzzwords that weren't systems and stuff like that, But, there is not as much attention by many on the additionality issue. It's not an easy thing to know. It's not, you can't really, you can't randomize that quite so easily. A big player could, but like, it's still not easy to know. But, you look around the table, who else is making the investments? And when you look around and everybody else is a for-profit player just with one bottom line, maybe that's the time to get up and leave. But that's a squishy thing to know what you're doing and whether your money is actually additional, is it concessionary, is it pushing the firm to do something they would otherwise wouldn't do. But that's where I tend to take a focus on like, well, what's the actual firm doing? And that's where I think we also have a lot of sometimes mistakes where things are in name only, sounding good, but they ultimately, I think, for instance, job growth is a commonly named outcome. But if you don't have any understanding of the underlying market structure of what this industry was doing, how do you could just be moving employees from one firm to another. You're calling it job growth. That's not job growth. So, it must be that the underlying enterprise that is being invested in that you're changing is actually addressing some market failure, that there's some clearly externalities, really the driving one. So climate change is an obvious one. There's other types of market failures that are externalities. Like if your core business has an externality story that you can be telling, now we're very solidly into safe space as far as I was concerned. If it's instead about price, so a lot of times you hear impact investing being like, oh, you're reaching poor households with a service that they weren't previously getting or getting at a too high a price. That's a viable but dangerous territory because now it's all about price. Right? It's like take the finance space. You can look at lenders that are lending at really high interest rates that people would say, oh, this is horrible. And you look at ones that are, making money at low rates and you say, that's great. That's impact investing. Well, that's all about price, right? And so you got to who gets to decide what that price is that labels you usurious versus impact investing. And And how do you actually write a contract that locks in? And that's not easy. So that's why I always prefer the externality story if I could.
But one comment on that, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is it if it's priced because you've done something to change the cost structure of the industry, or if it's priced because you've done something to increase the level of competition in the industry, that's different than if it's priced because you're given subsidized credit.
Absolutely.
And so I think a lot of times what the DFIs are doing is the former. It is things that are changing, that are investments that are changing the nature of the way markets work in a way that changes the cost structure, the level of competition.
Yes,
I don't think
agree.
we show that
The
very well, but I
challenge,
think that's
and
the
I
reality.
realize the challenge that makes me not sure is, but then, like, why was it, like, just ask the really annoying economist question of like, why wasn't it happening otherwise? Because that's an innovation that a for-profit firm should have. So like, and maybe your answer is just, well, they weren't. So what do you want from me?
So
We're going to do it.
People are not piling in to build fiber optic cables across the DRC. So that's an example of investment VI made. It's that kind of thing where there's a risk level that I think there's a risk level that the private sector is not willing to take.
That doesn't mean it's concessionary, which is okay.
Yeah.
If there's an
No, it's
externality.
yeah.
And that's a coordination story. So that I think.
Okay, let's go down.
I think
Let's
that
go,
works.
Liz.
Let me try and take a couple of the others. So your question wasn't about development policy, but I'm going to answer it about investments. So both, yes, that's sort of part of the exciting thing, which is taking risks in sort of new areas in terms of our kind of development, our kind of impact investing end of things. But there is real risk, and the risk of failure is embarrassment, really. I mean, not just losing money, but also the sort of reputational risk. So it's you have to have a little bit of kind of risk appetite, and sort of very good supportive sort of infrastructure to be able to try and whatever it is, lay that fiber across, or support a company to lay fiber where it hasn't been before, or go into fragile and conflict affected states. And you can't pivot that easily. I mean, if you've invested, you can't exit that quickly. It's not easy. So that was just on that. On the is development and climate a trade-off, and why are donors going into it? I think that people are because there is real, there's number one, there's really a climate emergency. So that is why people are moving, and people have been saying this for decades. So if anything, people are only coming to it too late. But I think the interesting thing I've seen more of is the convergence of people asking about inclusive climate finance. I wouldn't say it's kind of completely there, but I think the donors and others are kind of interested in that kind of additionality, which is, yes, there's plenty, your normal infrastructure play. There are interested pools of money in that, in kind of mainstream utilities or commercial industrial uses. But for kind of where it intersects with energy access, that is where you have to come together as the kind of development ecosystem. And there was one other point I wanted to make on that, but I will have to come back to it. Oh, that was it, transition finance. So this is on the trade-off point. I think the really hard side is that that there's the area of how do you who is going to invest to decarbonize manufacturing or kind of agriculture, especially agriculture, which is not always very profitable anyway. So I think that is an area that there's not a trade-off, but there's just a clear need for more people to go into that. But it's not always kind of tagged climate finance, because it can be very emissive, likewise kind of manufacturing. So I think this idea that there might be another category or something around transition finance could potentially be very helpful if it is not, if it really is truly helping going from one place to another, as it were. There's some easy win-wins, the resource efficiency ones you mentioned. Those are sort of fine because you don't really need to think about those. You just maybe need a nudge. But there are still some quite tricky sort of remaining issues. You can do all the hard ones now.
I don't even remember any of those. So in terms of the question of entrepreneurship and in governments and bureaucracies, obviously there are structural and other reasons as to why bureaucracies are very different. But bureaucracies also differ in terms of how much space they provide for more of that type of thing, entrepreneurial. And some of that is internal, and some of that is also working with external actors. And there's space to do far more on that. Let me give credit to Dean, your idea. I thought you would mention that of embedded labs where outside analysts and researchers would work with governments and with policy actors. Others call similar idea co-generation of knowledge. So you could think of models where people from outside and researchers in this room and others also would work with policy actors in bringing some of this innovation and entrepreneurialism within bureaucracies. The only one clarification, I'm not saying don't put any weight on inclusion and sustainability. Those are hugely important. The only point I'm making is don't put zero weight on growth when it comes to the poorest countries. Yes, it may mean less growth in developed countries where for reasons that we know. But when it comes to the Malawis and South Sudans of the world, we cannot put zero weight on growth because even in order to achieve the other objective, we need to have growth to be able to end extreme poverty in those places. I don't even remember any other questions. So.
Great. Hopefully we got to most of those questions. I don't remember all the questions.
Migration.
Migration. Was there
Yeah.
a migration question?
There was a low, you asked also a very short thought on the low versus medium income. At least, I think, I'm sure there's some that they're not doing it well, but I know there's certainly a mantra among many that the climate change is not being created by the low income countries, and likewise the burden should not be there either. The issue there is the adaptation and the vulnerability. So I think the recognition that the mitigation work is going to come from the middle income and up is. I'm not hearing too many dissents on that point in the conversations I'm in.
Dissents, but let me say,
Sounds like you do. So
no,
I know the
it's
context.
it's not dissents, but it's but I've heard voices from all the organizations represented here that are basically, talking about pure mitigation in lower income countries.
There's just not much carbon. The land use is a different issue. So
no,
but I wouldn't call that a burden,
yeah.
because you're actually, if you're successful, you're actually helping people make more money, and then also helping climate.
No, you're right, and there are lots of places where it coincides with reduction in air pollution and other local amenities that are also things that you say, well, okay, this is win-win. That's fine, but. Anyway, let me leave it there. I hope to have time for another round of questions, but I think we're basically out of time, even taking into account that we started a bit late. So let me thank Adnan, Liz, Dean, all three of you for a really interesting conversation, and let's. And then before we break, let me just make one more. Also thank the audience and so forth. One more quick announcement that. There is IGC has a call for proposals with a deadline of 5 p.m. GMT on the 14th of November. So I wanted to flag that to everyone in both rooms. Great. We have 15-minute break and then
No break.
No break. We go right in.
What's this next session?
I don't know.
I haven't looked, but we were.
Big exception in the mitigation. Yes, CBAM.
OC.
The cross-border investment. USA.
Oh.
That's going to force developing countries. CBAM, it's the cross-border adjustment.
The carbon.